200, right.
And I think, I don't know, we have 12 or so represented in Parliament, most of them with 1 or 2 members of Parliament. So there's lots of room. We have a big independent media. If you want to make noise, it's very easy to make noise in South Africa. But are you an effective player who can bring about change? The answer is no.
Yeah.
So things like the ATM, as it's called, it has no capacity to bring about change in South Africa.
You've lived right across Africa, worked right across Africa. I remember when we first met, you had worked in Nigeria a lot. We used to talk about that. I wanted to get your sense of what the history across Africa. This is, big anniversary this year, 60 years since 1960, the sort of the independence year across the continent. Okay, many before and many more afterwards, but it seemed to be a sort of one of those seminal dates. What do you think the lessons are from that period, 60 to 2020, for South Africa in particular? Because a lot of people thought, Mandela comes out, elections in South Africa, free elections in South Africa. South Africa's somehow going to renew Africa all by itself. This modern economy, lots of money, talented people, and all the rest of it. Where do you think we are on that trajectory?
Where we are after 60 years.
60 years in Africa and whatever, 30 years in South Africa.
In South Africa.
Yeah.
Is that the elite in Africa has completely failed to transform the African economies from what they inherited from the colonialists.
Right.
It's probably only one country in Africa that has fundamentally transformed the colonial economy, and that's Mauritius.
Wow.
The rest of Africa is still run on the economies that the colonialists set in place, including South Africa. And in South Africa, it's even older because the economic system we have was put in place by the British at the end of the 19th century when they discovered gold and diamonds.
Yeah.
So they put an economic system in place which is still running today. So that is really the reality of Africa.
Yeah.
You can't compare it to East Asia. The East Asians completely transformed the economic systems that the Malaysians, for example, inherited from British colonialism. Malaysia is a manufacturing economy. Sure. It's not a commodity producing economy.
Yeah.
Vietnam is now moving it was a French colony, and so on. Africa, this change has not happened.
People would say that the Meles Zenawi government in Ethiopia and now its successor, Abiy Ahmed, has a strategy along those lines.
But Ethiopia was never a colony.
Sure.
So you can't compare
the rest it's still part of Africa. But it also had this sort of pressure to produce commodities for export, and there wasn't much transformation of those commodities. They are now saying, and it's sort of Ethiopia's been held up, along with, say, Morocco and even Rwanda, as different models. Do you give that argument any truck, that we're seing?
No, is the short answer. Ethiopia, yes, they is making a difference.
Yeah.
But we have to realize Ethiopia had a feudal economy. It did not have a colonial economy.
Right.
And the society was very different. So one can't talk about Ethiopia and compare it to Nigeria. The two are not the same. Yeah. In the same way that South Africa is not the same as Nigeria. So there are huge differences in Africa. But I'm talking about the countries that were colonized as a result of the Berlin Conference of 1884. Those countries, they still retain the economic systems that the colonialists left behind when they left in 1960. There has been no transformation. Mauritius has moved from being a sugar economy to one of the most sophisticated manufacturing and services economy in Africa. They are the only ones who have really done it.
Is that a model? I mean,
definitely. It's a model for other African countries to go and study.
Because it is obviously a small place. It's a kind of geographically isolated in a way. It's got a kind of cheap labor pool next door. Well, not quite next door, but, in that region from Madagascar and so on. I mean, there are all those entities. And It's got a weird political system, but it has provided some stability. I mean,
it has transformed the economy.
Yeah.
From a sugar economy to what we see today.
And it's sustainable from what you can see.
It's totally sustainable.
Yeah. So that's a lesson even for South Africa to look
absolutely.
at what they've done. I mean, so, that book, the Studwell book, Studwell, How Asia Works, he isolated the three ideas that the East Asian economies have taken. One was agricultural transformation, which means land redistribution, however you do that. But as in most land redistribution, there are going to be some very unhappy campers, usually the old aristocracy, whatever, the old ruling class. Financial reform, broadening the scope of financial sector industries and so on. And then picking winners, and the government making a decision, in his view, a functioning state to make a decision about what the country's comparative advantage is, and tend to invest heavily. I mean, I think we talked a while back about South Korea, and you were very impressed with what they've done. And the whole history about South Korea creating a shipbuilding industry against the advice of the West, of the Americans, the IMF and the World Bank. They all said, don't even try to compete with Germany and the others. Of course they did, and they're now, I think, one of the biggest shipbuilding industries in the world. Do you go along with Studwell's sort of trio of ideas, land, finance, picking winners?
Yes, you have to have land reform in Africa.
Yeah.
Peasant agriculture has got low productivity.
Yeah.
And so if you want a productive agriculture that will sustain an urban population, Africa is a huge importer of food.
Yeah.
Although the majority of our African people are farmers, but it's an import. Countries like Nigeria are huge importers of food. So it means you have to restructure and reorganize your agricultural sector.
Yeah.
And to do that, obviously, finance goes with it, because you have to be able to finance the new entrepreneurs that go into agriculture. Well, the question of choosing winners and so on and so forth. First, you have to have entrepreneurs. You have to encourage entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
It's when you have an entrepreneurial class that you can pick and choose winners.
Right.
In Africa, as far as I can make out, what you have are commodity traders, and people who service commodity traders. So an entrepreneurial class that is owning manufacturing capacities, that is building manufacturing capacity, I don't see it, which is why we're importing clothes from Bangladesh and China and Vietnam, because we don't have the entrepreneurs to make clothes in the African countries.
I know everyone quotes him, but I'd have to raise Aliko Dangote in Nigeria. He started off, no question, as a trader. He parlayed his considerable fortune as a commodity trader into investment in cement plants. He's got, I think, about 15 or 20 across Africa now. He's committed $12 billion to this refinery, petrochems, and fertilizer plant in Lagos, which, it would help to transform Nigeria into a much more progressive industrialized economy. Surely there are people like that. He's not the only one, but just even looking at his case, surely is that not a very significant move?
Well, it is and it is not.
Right.
You can build a fertilizer plant, but if your agricultural system and your transportation system and your logistics system doesn't work, well, who is going to use your fertilizers? And Nigeria's logistics system doesn't work. The railways don't work. The roads are in a shambles. So Dangote can build his fertilizer plant. Yeah. He'll probably end up selling fertilizer to Latin America rather than to Nigeria.
Right. It's down to the government. But you'd accept that if they improve the transportation, the logistics, it could start to make a difference.
Oh, it could make a difference, but they are not doing so. I mean, the Nigerians had 3,000 kilometers of working railway at independence.
Yeah.
Today, they don't work. I think there's a few trains that run to Kano and Lagos, but not the network that they had. And you can look at Ghana, it's the same, and so on, and Sudan, and so on and so forth. So the comparison between Africa and Southeast Asia is a total fallacy, because the societies and the leadership and the social structures are so different.
So you mentioned Argentina as a comparative with South Africa earlier. So you think that Africa's got more in common in terms of political economy with Latin America?
South Africa. Yes.
South Africa, but not other Africa.
No, not
But I mean, I think it's true to say, though, number of elections in South Africa and the political paraphernalia that goes with that, in terms of pluralism and free press and so on, you don't find that in many countries in Asia. You certainly don't find it in the biggest economy, China, and in some respects, freedom of political expression is diminishing in India under the current regime. Yeah. Ditto in Pakistan. So I'm wondering, I mean, are we going to get into a situation where some people will be arguing that Africa's political openness is a source of economic weakness? I know that's arguments old and tired, but it may come back.
I think it's an old and tired argument. That's not the source of Africa's political.
But you did say, right, that the political situation in Africa is so different from East Asia, which is true. But I mean, one of the big differences is just the authoritarianism that a country like Vietnam, and sure, their history was horrendous colonial rule under the French, and then, 20th century bombardment by the Americans. And then they've come out of that, but with a pretty authoritarian government. They've achieved an economic miracle, but at a cost. There's very limited individual freedom, political freedom. Is that what Africa's going to have to pay?
Well, for me, as I say, the comparison with Southeast Asia is not an appropriate one, because there was a huge intervention by the United States in the development of the Asian tigers.
Right.
Because the United States this was during the Cold War, and it was out there fighting communism.
Yeah.
So in the development of countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, and so on, the United States was a very big player in the development of those countries as part of its fight against communism. There's no reason for the United States to put the energy and the resources it put into Southeast Asia into Africa, because its interests are not threatened.
What about Europe as Africa's nearest neighbor, and alternating between horror of millions of people swimming across the Mediterranean, jihadis blowing up churches in France and Italy, whatever. I mean, all the sort of the European policy on Africa, it seems to be pretty schizophrenic at the moment. But there's a combination. You can sort of see that there's this sort of migration thing that is the fascist parties in Europe are using now as a pretty potent threat to mobilize popular votes in quite an alarming way. We've seen it certainly in Eastern Europe and now spreading into Western Europe. The second thing is there's this sort of European and American paranoia about China, particularly China, but I think that we'll see that extend to other Asian countries. And, you know, the Europeans are very well aware that China is coming with its chopsticks and eating their lunch in Africa, and that China is showing Africa